I genuinely believe that no matter where, when, what, or how you're shooting, anything can be cinematic. Maybe some of you already know this, but you don't need the latest, craziest gear to achieve the cinematic look if you can master the basics of your camera. So let's quickly go over the settings that you want to use to achieve that cinematic look. First off, let's talk f-stop. A lower f-stop or a wider open aperture will give you that shallow depth of field or that blurry background that is so commonly associated with a cinematic look. Now, I'm all for shooting wide open and getting that nice blur in the background, but something to note is that it isn't absolutely essential to shoot wide open all of the time. And sometimes shooting at something like 3.5 or even as high as 5.6 will still achieve a nice bokeh and blurred out background. Don't mask bad composition or take any shortcuts in the other tips that we're going to cover later on by just blurring out that background and calling it cinematic all of a sudden. The next thing is shutter speed. A simple and basic rule without going too much in depth is you should use a 180-degree shutter angle. This means using a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, it's recommended that you use 1/50 shutter speed. This ensures that you get the right motion blur in your footage and you avoid that super jerky, jagged look that if you crank your shutter speed up too high. And yes, you should be shooting in 24 frames per second if you're creating cinematic footage that you don't intend to slow down later. ISO is pretty basic. Keep it as low as you can. Make sure it doesn't pump too high because it's going to introduce unwanted noise and grain into your shot. Once we've covered our basic triangle of exposure, being aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, all being set to what's going to give us that most cinematic look, you might be like, okay, well, how do I control my exposure now? That's when ND filter comes into play because it gives you that fourth point of contact. It's just something that you can attach onto the front of your lens, giving you another way of letting in more or less light. Usually less light because you've locked down these settings to achieve that cinematic look. And you don't want to crank your shutter or aperture too high because then you're going to lose some of that desired effect you're going to be getting from those. Having that ND filter means we can just crank it down. A little bonus feature that I want to quickly touch on is you can attach a mist filter, which is going to give you that nice like creamy highlight roll off and kind of gives this dreamy effect to your footage. Do a little bit of research on mist filters. Some people love them, not everybody does, but they're definitely trending right now. And it gives it quite a nice like soft look to your footage with that filter being on the front of your lens. Let's talk composition and framing. Now, you don't need to overthink it, but some basic composition and framing will go a long way. If you think in the most simplistic terms of creating some nice depth or composing a shot that looks visually pleasing to you, that's for the most part going to achieve 90% of what you need to do. It's always a bonus if you do some basic research like the rule of thirds, center framing, leading lines, foreground, or whatever else the main kind of composition techniques are. But my advice for this is experiment with what you think looks good to your eye and try and like figure out why and make sure you're doing it intentionally rather than just pointing your camera at something and shooting. One of the biggest things I look out for within my composition is depth. The easiest way to create depth is by introducing 3 elements into your frame. You can have some foreground, you can have your subject or main point of interest, and then you can have that background, which can be nice and blurred out because you've got that aperture so wide open. The other key aspect I really like to focus on is just having some leading lines, or at least noticing in your frame where your eye is drawn to. You got to realize that when you show an image to the viewer, their eyes are immediately going to be drawn or led around within that frame to a certain points of interest. Having leading lines is one of the easiest ways I've found to draw the attention of the viewer to the part of the frame that you want them to notice. Take a look at this frame right now. I've got leading lines with this coming into my face. I've got these shelves kind of coming into my eyes, and it's kind of just drawing all the attention in from this frame into right here, which is where I want you to be focusing on. Take a couple of extra seconds when you're setting up some sort of cinematic shot and notice these kind of things in your environment. It can be streets, it can be trees, it can be horizon lines, it can be mountains, it can really be anything. But just taking that extra step of finding them can make a much more visually stimulating and appealing shot for the viewer to look at. The other thing to think about with your composition is something that is called the lighting triangle. And it's basically where you place your subject between you, the camera person, and the light source. This ensures that you get a nice backlit image that also just further accentuates the depth in your shot because you have those layers of light. Rather than just having the light coming straight from behind the camera, lighting up and filling in everything within your frame, you can rather put your subject in the middle or at least slightly off to the side, and you can have this triangle within your composition almost every time. Speaking of lighting, let's go actually into a little bit of detail about lighting because this is where things really start to come to life. When creating a cinematic shot, lighting is everything. Even super simple lighting setups can create massive impact. But the main thing we need to focus on is backlight and controlling our shadows. Backlighting can create depth and make your subject stand out. But the real magic happens is when we start to notice the absence of light and start focusing on the shadows within our frames. When you start noticing shadows, it adds depth, gives texture, and really starts to make everything a lot more interesting. You can see in this simple demo here that if I just lit up my face straight from the front, it's quite a flat and boring shot, and it really doesn't create any depth. By simply rotating this light, which also could be used in the same way in a naturally lit environment, say for example by rotating our subject to put the sun more behind them, you can create these significantly more interesting shots. It's simple when you know how, and as long as you keep an eye out for those shadows, you can ensure that you're moving your subject to fit just right with it. Movement is another incredibly powerful tool, but it doesn't have to necessarily mean camera movement. In fact, subject movement within your frame can be just as cinematic. Even when you're filming on your own, you can try and move the subject within frame. Whether they're walking into the shot, they're interacting with their environment, or just moving around or adjusting something within that composition that you've created. It gives the shot a lot more energy, and you can really start to play around with it. Once we've put all the effort into capturing our scenes in the most cinematic way possible, there's a few extra things that we can do within the edit. So let's go over everybody's absolute favorite thing for cinematic videos, and that's color grading. Color is one of the most important ways that you can set the mood of your shot, whether you're creating something warm and cozy or something quite cold and harsh. The thing to note is that you should have a vague idea of what kind of color grade you would like to do in post-production while you're actually creating these shots, just so you can ensure that maybe your lighting conditions, or at the very least, the white balance within your camera can be set to the mood that you would like to further enhance when you do begin your post-production process. When you're just starting out, you definitely don't need to go overboard. A simple and clean color grade can work wonders and take your footage from something that's quite mediocre to something that really pops and stands out on screen. If you don't want to bother with the hassle of trying to convert log footage back to Rec 709 and then still work on your stylistic grade, I have an instant color grading preset that you can purchase right now, and it takes your footage from something like this to something like this with simply just pasting it onto your footage, whether it's a drone, cinema camera, or even something as simple as your phone. They're on sale right now. Check them out if you want them. If you do want to work on the color grade by yourself and put that extra effort in, I think a key element of this is that you work with juxtaposed colors. There's a reason that that teal and orange color grade blew up so much, but within cinema and the film industry, they're always using opposing colors within color grades. So just look out for what your opposites might be. This blue and this orange right here is a perfect example, and you can use that same theory within your color grading. Color grading is a massive topic, and there's multiple videos that go in depth into this, so we're not going to cover it too hard right here. But the key notes is don't overdo it and go too crazy with your color grades. Subtlety is key here, so just make some slight adjustments and don't crank those sliders all the way to the ends like a maniac. Here's something that a lot of people overlook, and it's sound design. Sound design is critical in making your footage feel more cinematic, because when you can create those feelings, it somehow also looks more cinematic. Take a look at this clip before we've done any of the post-production to it. Now, if I look at that scene and I really try and break down what I'm going to be hearing in there, and not only the obvious key things, but also things like atmospheric sounds and background noises, and then we just spend a couple of extra minutes adding that in, take a look at the same shot and see how much more immersive and how much more you're actually feeling that scene. It doesn't have to be crazy. Either capture the sound effects in real life with a microphone, or just go online and find some of the other sound effects and slap them on. A mix of both is usually what I kind of end up doing. It's obvious that a large portion of creating an entire cinematic scene and piecing your cinematic clips together is a massive process that happens in the edit. If you're a creator that doesn't have the time to put these together, or just the skills that are necessary to really pull the most out of that footage that you possibly can, my editing agency, thecreatorlabs.co, specializes in turning raw, boring footage into cinematic masterpieces. Let us handle the mundane tasks like cutting, so you can focus on the tasks that matter most, like creating. It's all linked down below, and it's on a massive discount right now for the launch, but there's very limited seats. As we fill up, the price goes up to what it is worth. So if you are interested, get on it. Other than that, happy cinematic shooting. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.